Everyone. You know what? I'm probably being a bit of an idiot here because what I'm thinking is I'm like, oh, I should start recording, so I'm recording on time. But I suppose what that now means that anyone here who's watching the recording, who was not here initially, you're going to be noticing me fiddling around with some stuff, including turning up my volume. Also acknowledging that I have new hair. The most recent video you would have seen, I would have had different hair, and you're also going to see me changing my channel and promoting the video, because there may not be, let's see, we got 2 people here right now, which is fewer than there should be. So I will just fix this, and I'll say what we're going to do today. So hello everyone, today we're going to be responding to a video by Rationality Rules. You can watch the full video in the comments, in the description rather. And I suppose there's something I should say about Rationality Rules, just to, give the kind of the fallacy identifiers something to complain about. Because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to poison the well. I'm going to do some ad hominem, because I should note that Rationality Rules recently, coincidentally, I was planning on responding to this video at this time anyway, but he coincidentally had a bit of an embarrassment recently where it was revealed that he basically made a video refuting I believe, secular historian. I wish I could remember his name. I feel like the historian's name might well be Tom Holland. Oh, someone's asking what happened to Frodo's eyes. That's a very good question. Yes. So essentially, somebody suggested that sometimes my videos can be blurry, and someone suggested it could be because of the camera latching onto this guy here. And I do actually get a little display that tells me the camera is focusing on him. So I was like, well, what I'll do is I'll cover up his face, won't I? Anyway, so yeah, basically there's a historian called Tom Holland, not to be confused with Spider-Man. He is an atheist historian, but he has made an argument that basically a lot of Western morality has come from Christianity. And, that's not an argument we're going to touch on here because we've got lots of other things to get into. But essentially, Rationality Rules made a video debunking him, but it was specifically supposed to be debunking his book. He wrote a book about how our morality comes from Christianity, and he had a quote in the video that he was saying, this is a very stupid quote. But the thing is, the quote isn't from the book. However, the quote is misattributed to the book in the Wikipedia article. Very pretty much guaranteeing that Rationality Rules just read the Wikipedia article for the book and wrote a debunking of the book based on that. That would seem to be the case. I could maybe give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he read the book through and then he only started to compile quotes later on. And, he saw that quote in his research and thought, oh, that's a good quote, and didn't realize it wasn't something in the book. That's a possibility. But yeah, it's obviously a very embarrassing look. And it certainly leads to the possibility that this is a guy who seeks to debunk authors without having actually read what they said. Of course, in reality, that doesn't, having him be wrong on this one area doesn't mean he's wrong on everything. Which is what the fallacy bros can point out, but just to give them a little bit more basis to complain. I will say that, obviously, when people make certain types of mistakes, you can take that as an indication they'll make those types of mistakes in other areas. But we are going to, continue looking at this video. I just want to make a quick post very briefly. Just forgive me being silent for a minute. Exclamation mark and post. Lovely. All right. So essentially, we're going to be looking at, I haven't actually got the video up yet. I'm just a complete disaster area, aren't I? So we're going to be looking at this video called Why the Bible, or rather, the Bible is Evil. Here's why it is, so on and so forth. And I'm kind of going into this video blind, but obviously the title is, let me just get it up for you. I believe the title is Why Apologists Ignore These Verses. So if we ignore them, that is certainly embarrassing for us. But nonetheless, I mean, I've read the Bible a good number of times. I imagine if this is talking about the impression you get from the thumbnail, which I won't be able to show you, but because it's I don't really know how you get the thumbnail to like appear as the full screen, but whatever. Yeah, the impression I get is that it's going to be about the conquest, which is the early part of the Bible. The fun thing, of course, about the the whole conquest of the whole early part of the Bible is a lot of people who maybe they've made attempts to read the Bible and then fallen short. What that guarantees is that they probably read the early parts of the Bible maybe more times than other things. So we're ready. Okay. We're now going to just start playing. Everything seems to be in order. Let me know if there's any issues with the volume and stuff. Let's go.
This video is kindly sponsored by Shortform.
Yeah, okay, so the depravity of Deuteronomy.
History remembers them as ruthless conquerors. Their campaigns left cities in ruins and populations extinguished. The Mongol Empire, initiated by Genghis Khan, carved out the largest contiguous land empire in history, and they didn't do so by turning the other cheek. They approached cities and offered a merciful ultimatum: become our subjects or be destroyed. If the city accepted, they fell into slavery. If they refused, they fell to the sword. This barbarous...
Hello, Joshua Curry. Yes, Superlord, I think that's a very good initial thing to say. I guess I'll let something be, so I'm not just responding to the video before the video's even started. Oh yeah, AI art.
Has always been recognized for what it is: evil. But what if I told you...
That's an interesting thing to say, because I actually, in my experience, I don't know that many people who cast moral judgment on the Mongol Empire. I feel like most people, if anything, they're kind of like they view the Mongol Empire as impressive. I've never met anyone who says, "Oh, the Mongol Empire, they were evil. They were the most wicked empire to have ever existed." I mean, yeah, if you look at it in objective or compared to other empires, and you just said, well, you look at the raw numbers of the matter, you'd probably say, oh yeah, they did kill a lot of people for no real apparent benefit. I mean, obviously they just expanded out, killed a lot of people, and then collapsed. But funnily enough, I actually would not say that I've noticed people be particularly standing in judgment over the Mongol Empire. I think largely because we just accept that was a reality of human history, that nomadic empire is going to do what nomadic empire is going to do.
The commands bearing a striking resemblance to these conquests can be found in one of the world's most revered religious texts.
What? I mean, I don't think that any civilization covered in the Bible, I mean, except for the Persians, other empires got really big, but yeah, obviously the big thing about the Mongols that stands out is the size and breadth of their empire, which of course was never matched in biblical times.
Does the Bible present us with a supposed all-loving God who issues commands comparable to the monstrosities of the Mongol hordes?
So it's like a proper documentary, although yeah, someone pointed out it's probably AI art. Hello, Superlord 1.
In the early 13th century, a man named Temujin united the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppes under his rule. History would come to know him as Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire. Under Genghis Khan's leadership, the Mongols launched a series of military campaigns that would reshape the regions of Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. The Mongol war machine operated on a simple principle. When approaching a city or settlement, they would offer terms of surrender. Accept, and you might live as subjects of the empire. Refuse, and face annihilation. This wasn't mere intimidation. The Mongols were fully prepared to make good on their threats.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to, right? Because if you don't make good on that threat, then no one's going to take you seriously the next time you come around conquering them. And this is not something that was unique to the Mongol Empire. It's, I think, basically been practiced by every single country or empire that's ever been serious about a military campaign. Obviously, I mean, the other example is Oliver Cromwell in Ireland. He would go up to cities and say, hey, you need to surrender to us and we'll let you live. But obviously that necessitates that if the city then says, no, we're not going to surrender, there has to be a more extreme reprisal based on that. where some amount of the population is massacred. Because in the long run, if we're accepting that countries are going to fight wars, which they are, then actually that causes less death, because otherwise every single siege, the people defending the siege or defending the city have every incentive to fight as hard as they can to keep you out. But if you say, hey, the best way that this is going to go for you is if you just let us in, then nobody dies. So actually in the long run, I don't know, maybe that is a better thing to do.
Cities that resisted were often razed to the ground, their populations massacred without mercy. One such example is the siege of Urgench in 1221. When the city finally fell after a 6-month siege, the Mongols killed everyone except for the artisans, who were deported to Mongolia. Historical estimates suggest an extremely high death toll for this single conquest, ranging from 100,000 to well over 1 million people. Or consider the sack of Baghdad in 1258, where the Mongols under Hulagu Khan destroyed the city, effectively ending the Islamic Golden Age. Reports claim that the waters of Tigris rang black with the ink of Baghdad's libraries and red with the blood of its scholars. The Mongol conquests were not just about territorial expansion, they were a systematic dismantling of resistant cultures, a reshaping of the world through fear and violence.
This is a very long, I don't know, okay, so we're almost at the end. I mean, I guess, so the context here is what? Just that the Mongols were bad, and this establishes that it's possible for, countries, empires, whatever you want to call them, to be bad.
Cities that surrendered were often spared wholesale slaughter, but still faced enslavement, heavy taxation, and cultural suppression. Over a 200-year span, it's estimated that the Mongol conquests resulted in the death of 40 million people. That's 11% of the world's population at the time. Truly, the horrors of the Horde are staggering. But as we shift our focus to the God of ancient Israel, we must consider, are we facing a divinely sanctioned counterpart? The fifth book of the Torah, Deuteronomy, contains series of speeches by Moses to the Israelites as they prepare to enter the Promised Land. Setting aside concerns of historicity, among these speeches are instructions for warfare that Moses is supposedly receiving from God, which bear a deeply unsettling resemblance to the Mongol strategies we've just explored.
I don't see what would be unsettling about it. You would expect that God would issue commands that are consistent with the most effective warriors ever. If God is supposed to be really supreme, then if God says, hey, I want you to conquer this land, then obviously the way he's going to suggest doing that, or it makes sense the way he would suggest doing that, would be a really effective way of doing it.
Here's Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 15. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use your plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies.
So it's worth noting, this is not a biblical statement. It is a universal statement of how war has always been practiced until very recently. This was the standard. You essentially say, hey, if you basically make things peaceful, obviously that means, we have conquered you. That's the point. You are accepting that. So in having conquered you, you will be subject to us. But if you resist and say, hey, we don't want to be subject to you, all right, that's fine. But obviously, in order to show that there is a consequence to resisting us, we're going to strike back at you. And that would mean, again, I will stress here, I think that it's very unlikely that this means kill every single man. I think what it means is there should be an indiscriminate slaughter where lots of people die, but you're not going to literally hunt down every single last person, because that's not even worth your effort. And then, of course, you would then say, well, in addition to that, we're going to take your wives and children as slaves, because what else are you going to do? Like, if loads of the men have just been killed in this battle, what else is going to happen to them? Like, they're just going to be left to starve in the middle of nowhere. But the point is, this isn't like a matter of defending this as a unique command of the Bible. This isn't something like how the Bible says you shouldn't eat pork when, you know, most other cultures would eat pork, or you shouldn't mix fabrics or whatever. This is a statement, or this is a rule of engaging in combat that basically every single civilization was doing. So really, it's almost not even worth acknowledging, because it's basically just God saying you should engage in war the way that everyone else engages in war. I mean, yeah, if you study like ancient history at all, you can see, and I'm not saying it happened every single time. Maybe say, well, the Bible's saying here it happens every single time. Again, I think that's also probably reading too much into it to assume it's saying literally this is how it has to go every single time. But this is a typical way that a siege of a city might unfold. Hey, you know, we don't want to have to besiege your city. Best thing you can do for everyone here is surrender to us. But if you're going to make us do it, like you're going to make us like sacrifice lives having to take you down, there's going to be consequences to that. Let's see. What's up, Casey? What's up, Blake? How's it swagging? Let's see. None of the Canaanite nations wanted to coexist except one, and they got what they wanted. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, we're going to get into this. I suppose Rationality Rules is probably not going to acknowledge it. So just to clarify, the Canaanite civilizations practiced child sacrifice. If you are a Christian, then that is the assumption you're working with. So obviously, right now, so my understanding is that this is talking about other nations around. So Edom, Moab. I'm trying to think, like, so Assyria. So if Israel was engaged in wars and was going outside of Canaan, then their objective there isn't to take over those cities forever, but basically just to, as part of war, put these surrounding nations basically in their place, stop them from just, you know, constantly attacking the Israelites and stuff like that. But when we talk about the Canaanites, the key thing is this was a culture that was practicing child sacrifice. This was a culture that was doing something so evil that they had to be destroyed. And having said that, though, even though that's the case, for the nations that were receptive to being taken into the fold of Israelite culture, there was actually some reconciliation. Of course, you can see this on like an individual level with Rahab, for example, who, you know, accepted and basically defended the Israelite people conquering. Yeah, Joshua Curry says, archaeologists confirm the burning of children in sacrifice. Yes.
The parallels between this peace offering from an apparently loving God and the peace offering from the Mongols are obvious. Like
again, so just clarify, the peace offering from God is, I'm going to take the punishment for your sin upon myself and we will be reconciled. That is the peace offering from God. But the point is that at this time in history, God had a specific relationship with Israel. And again, his peace offering to Israel was one of, you obey the rules and I will ignore, or, you know, at least be lenient with regards to all the times that you rebel against me. However, because God was choosing an earthly nation for himself, all the things that come with having an earthly nation extend from that. But ultimately, that's not really from God, in that the mediator there is this earthly kingdom. Like, if this was literally a kingdom run by God, it wouldn't have these laws. And we know that because essentially what we have in Christianity is a kind of invisible kingdom that is run by God, and it doesn't say anything like this. So
the ancient Israelites are instructed to approach cities with terms of surrender. Those who accept face subjugation, forced labor in this case, which, according to God's laws in Leviticus, meant a harsh and oppressive fate.
Again, the other thing is here, I don't know whether or not, and I must admit, this could be a case where, you know, I'm missing something in the Bible. I'm not aware of any case in the Bible where the Israelites are commanded to make war against nations outside of Canaan, meaning that once the kingdom of Israel is established, the only reason why this law would apply is if other nations start a war with them. So if Assyria attacks them, or one of the Phoenician cities attacks them, or Egypt attacks them, then insofar as Israel is able to, they would be able to strike back. And you then have to ask, well, what's the alternative in this case? Let's say that Assyria attacks, we're talking, let's say, the kingdom of Israel, when it's basically all of Canaan is united under that kingdom. Kingdom of Israel. Obviously, I'm talking before it split in two. So let's say that Assyria attacks. What is the alternative to fighting back and destroying their cities and basically hampering their ability to continue fighting the war? Is it to just not attack them and wait for them to repeatedly build up their strength so they can attack you and campaign in your cities? That wouldn't really make much sense. Surely you have to go on the offensive at some point in order to capitalize on a situation where you feel like you might be able to do them damage and force peace terms, in which case, how do you handle those peace terms? Surely, basically, if you just attack the cities and then say, all right, here's the deal. You can completely resist us and make us lose a huge amount of our soldiers trying to besiege your city, and then we will just be totally lenient with you and not respond to that in any way. That wouldn't really make much sense as a strategy.
Those who refuse face total destruction.
Yeah, okay, this is actually... let's actually turn to this. So there were many people who were not ethnically Israelites. Read Joshua 8:33. Yeah, I kind of made myself look like a bit of an idiot, because I was like, if you've read, had multiple attempts at reading the Bible, you'll probably have read the first bit many times. But I really need to I could definitely stand to learn some more about, have a more encyclopedic knowledge of these accounts. Oh, this is a really long account, but okay, ready? So 8:33. And all Israel and their elders and officers and their judges stood on this side of the ark and on the side before the priests and Levites, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and as well as the stranger, as he that was born among them. Half of them over against Mount Gerizim, and half of them over against Mount Ebal, as Moses of the Lord had commanded before, that they should bless the people of Israel. So, yeah, the important line there is as well as the stranger. And I suppose that's the big thing, right? In the Old Testament, it's constantly saying that you should respect the stranger, respect the sojourner who remains among you. Yes, it's possible these were people coming from outside of Canaan, but I think it's very likely that these were people who were perhaps even seeing the kind of the light of God, seeing that what God was offering was a much better state of existence than sacrificing children to idols. And they were coming over voluntarily, which means that every single person who was still remaining in these Canaanite cities was basically, at least in some sense, choosing to side with a culture of child sacrifice. It wasn't as if, I guess you can make a kind of an analogy to the current situation. The people who were viewed as the enemy of Israel were boxed into these open air concentration camps, and they weren't allowed to leave, and then they were being attacked. No, there was a very, Israel had very permeable borders, and anyone who wanted to come over to, that, basically enter into that covenant was functionally welcome to.
But the comparison doesn't end here. Let's examine the following 3 verses. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are at a distance from you, and do not belong to the nations nearby. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Here, God's...
Yeah, so essentially this is about... there's something else I should mention, but first of all, this is about a total destruction of sin. And when you have a culture that is deeply immoral, which again, you have to be, if you are going to kind of criticize the Bible on the terms of the Bible by basically saying, well, let's look at what the Bible says about itself, then if that's going to be your line of criticism, you also have to think, well, what does the Bible say about the other people? and it says that they are engaged in human sacrifice. And I think we can reasonably assume this was a very evil, wicked culture. So to me, that I would say that totally justifies saying there needs to be a destruction of that culture. And you ultimately can't, especially if we're talking, if you couldn't have like re-education camps or something, you didn't have the infrastructure for that. The only way you could be destroying this culture was to kill a large number of people who are part of that culture. But the other thing I would stress, because this is very like worth bearing in mind, God is the ultimate reason why anyone is alive, and he's the ultimate reason why anyone will die. If like whenever I die, however I die, it will be because God has determined I'll die. I'm pretty sure in the Bible it says like he numbers how long, like basically determines how long every single person will live, which of course logically makes sense. So this like criticism of, oh, I can't believe God commands for people to be killed, it really rings very hollow if you understand, like if you are starting from a Christian perspective where you recognize, well, the reason why anyone's going to die is because God has ordained them to die, and therefore actually the only real difference here, I mean, these people could have died, like, sure, they could have lived to old age, but it still would have been God's fault they died. So if you're blaming God for dying, that's just a pretty dumb criticism, because obviously God is the one who put you on earth in the first place. God's the one who's taking you back. It's kind of like a child getting mad at their parent for taking them out of like a playpen that they put them in, or like a crib or something. Like you put your child in the crib, they take them out. That's kind of your authority. And of course, actually what you're doing is you're kind of bringing them back to you when you do that. Obviously, not a perfect analogy. I'm not saying that the world is like a crib or something like that. But the point is, if you think God put you on this earth, and actually his ultimate plan, like what he would like, is for you to come back to him, the idea of God killing people and God being the reason why people die is just not going to be that offensive to you. Whereas, so yeah, you apply that to these accounts of these atrocities, and same thing applies, right? Like I don't really see how it would make a difference that God is choosing to kill these particular people, or lead to death these particular people in one way, as opposed to the 100 billion ways that he has led to everyone else dying who has ever died in human history. So yeah, that's point one. And but of course the other thing is, considering that in this case actually it's part of his righteous judgment. I mean, there's lots of people who are perfectly good people, like, well, not perfectly good people, but perfectly good by the kind of standard of like looking at human history, who have died, and they've just died for like no reason randomly. Surely that's worse than these cultures who are actively doing something evil, doing something. All right.
Commands descend into a moral abyss. For certain.
Yeah, this is a good point. Yeah, so Israel was constantly being attacked. So I'm not going to claim that Israel didn't pick fights, but again, the culture that they picked to fight with was a very deeply evil culture. So yes.
In specified groups, there is not even an offer of peace. The instruction is for complete annihilation. And
okay. And the other thing, sorry, I should stress, although I don't. Basically, when you read complete and stuff like that, it's worth noting, and the analogy people always make is, if you are familiar with the way that sports fans will talk, they'll say, "Oh, we totally destroyed this team." And that doesn't mean that you like killed them. It doesn't mean that their stadium is now in rubble. People will use exaggerated language, and that's just something to bear in mind. So again, I'm not saying this to be like, oh, it doesn't count or whatever, because obviously it means something. It's still saying, it's getting at the fact that there should be a mass destruction to correspond to the extreme evilness of this culture. But if your particular objection, and this could be a particular like legitimate objection, is that there was some systemic effort to hunt down every single last person, well, I don't think that's really what the scriptures mean to say. I think scriptures mean to say you should go in as if to destroy everyone, but obviously you're not actually going to do that for practical reasons, and maybe you could say to some extent moral reasons. But the other thing, he says there's not really like an offer of peace here. Well, as has been pointed out, there is plenty of evidence that there were sojourners among the Israelites, and I'm wondering if he's going to point out Rahab, who of course was not offered peace, but she like kind of was proactive about that. And I suppose that's the other thing here, right? If you are part of a culture that is sacrificing children, I think maybe you do need to be a bit proactive about being reconciled to God. Like this idea that you first of all need the nation of Israel to come up to you, and like you're in your city, you're like busy burning your baby alive on a fire to a big like horned golden devil idol, and then you need Israel to come up to your walls and say, hey, here's our peace offering, blah blah blah, surrender to us and we will let you off. And you're, oh yeah, let's surrender to them. Actually, no, you shouldn't have like needed to wait for that to happen. Especially if I think it's reasonable to say people did know about the Israelites and they were aware of them as a alternative force. Semi-related, but will there ever be a 5 reasons I'm not a Catholic? Yes, there will be, and also it is scripted. It is. I wrote that video in advance. The thing is, I was planning on releasing it. It's a while away. I was planning on releasing it on the basically close to Halloween, because Halloween is also Reformation Day, so that just makes a lot of sense.
An act chillingly reminiscent of the Mongols' most brutal conquests. Now, these verses present the believer.
This is it, yeah. Don't forget about Ruth, who was from Moab and in the line of Christ. Yeah, that's the thing. There's obviously the other thing that needs to be stressed, because I'm saying like, oh, Israel this, Israel that, oy vey, chosen people of God. This is like the wider context here, of course, is that we know that actually Israel is ultimately going to prove themselves to be just as corrupt as all these other nations. In fact, again, this is one of the situations where my confidence in my ability to immediately remember exact verse from the Bible is failing me. But I'm pretty sure it says, Israel's actually worse. And I don't. That's one of those examples where, again, I think it's using exaggerated language, because I think that these cultures were really, really terrible. But is it Stephen who says this? I'm trying to think. But I'm sure there is at least someone who says in the New Testament that the way that the Jews are being in the first century is worse than these ancient nations. And that's the point. So you have to kind of recognize that context of, yes, there is this, oh, you need to go and destroy this culture. But that's not a racialistic thing. That is a judgment on immorality thing. And we know that because, as pointed out here, there are lots of people who are not part of the ethnic group of Hebrews who are brought in to that family. And ultimately what we know is that the ethnic group of Hebrews, I would say, statistically speaking, probably, it's not really clear how many converted in the first century. Certainly we know now that people who would consider themselves ethnically Jewish aren't very likely to be Christian. But I think, maybe they're actually some of the least likely to come to God. And therefore that further confirms that it's not a racialistic thing, so it has to spread out everywhere.
With a profound moral quandary. How does one reconcile these commands, allegedly given by an all-loving God, with ethics, human rights, and all things good? How can one say that when the Mongols throw babies from rooftops, they are to be universally condemned, but when the ancient Israelites should do the same, they are to be revered? How can an act be simultaneously abhorrent when committed by one group?
By the way, Joshua Curry, have I never seen you here before? You're coming in with some real. You're being a bit of an MVP. Well, I don't want to not to cast dispersions on anyone else, but you're being a bit of an MVP with coming in with the the truth bombs, and we stand.
Yet righteous when performed by another.
Cool. Well, I'm glad to see you, and your presence is noted and welcome. I'm just thinking what I've been realizing I need to try and do, because my goal is to basically, for every video I respond to, do a one and done situation, unless it's like a really long video. So what I probably need to do is just let it play a little bit and be a little less aggressive with responding, so that we can actually get more than a fifth of the way through when we are a third of the way through recording.
Short form. What is it?
That helps. It's very ironic, by the way, that this guy, I started off at the beginning saying that he got in trouble, had a bit of an embarrassing moment where he appeared to quote the Wikipedia summary for a book as if it was the book. And now I believe I'm right that the whole thing of short form is that they condense books and like make them, shorter, which is a very awkward thing to be promoting, very ironic. I'm a seminary grad and a youth pastor in South Dakota. Oh, that's cool. South Dakota. Yeah. Now that's not the one that's like got Fargo in it. That's the one. Wait, does South Dakota? Does South Dakota have the Mount Rushmore? I imagine. See, I think in my head, if you were to say, like basically when I think about Dakota, I'm like North Dakota is Fargo. That's where people get thrown into wood chippers. South Dakota is Mount Rushmore.
Most believers, the depravity of Deuteronomy is simply not an issue, since these troubling verses are rarely, if ever, read verbatim in religious services. In fact, many religious leaders actively avoid addressing these passages altogether.
I would say this, one of the reasons why these aren't addressed is because the narrative sections of the Old Testament tend to not get very much focus because there is so much basically the New Testament is one massive theological treatise. So you can like get stuff from the Old Testament and it can be useful. But even then, it will often be things where there is some unique theological insight. So, for example, the book of Ruth is a good example where I use the word example twice there, where in reading Ruth, you can like see some stuff about how God works. You can get like a lot of life lessons from that book. The problem is that the main life lesson you get from this stuff is just that God is in judgment over human evil. And that is something that is communicated, thank you, in many other places.
Preferring to focus on more palatable sections of scripture, such as love thy neighbor. But some believe...
I mean, also, this depends, because if you're talking about like mainline churches, I think there are some churches that obviously do have that attitude of just Christianity is a happy, clappy, lovey, let's all just be friends club or whatever. And these would be kind of like your ecumenical churches. And I imagine that they would have a problem with something like this because, this would be an idea of God that is contrary to what they're talking about. But I remember when I was having dinner with someone from my church, and I can't actually remember the context. It was not so bizarre as for them to have just like mentioned it out of nowhere, but they started talking about actually I know exactly what it was. Okay, so I went to a tour of the British Museum that was led by someone, and essentially the tour was showing all of the cases where people have thought that the Bible was historically inaccurate, and then actually when we've looked at archaeology, we've discovered that archaeology has confirmed what's in the Bible. And, so it was going through things like stories in the Bible about certain Assyrian kings and Hittites and all that sort of stuff, where, people thought, oh, this is just a storybook or whatever. And then we found out seemingly exactly the story that the Bible tells, told through, looking at the archaeological evidence. And I think in advance of, or in anticipation of that, someone was talking about having organized it and saying that, it's one of the values in reading. And they were talking specifically about Samuel and Kings and saying how this shows, because obviously what you see in Samuel and Kings is the damage caused to Israel by the fact they didn't root out this evil entirely. So, that was just like a random conversation I was having. But it was like that's an example of how people are certain people in more kind of evangelical circles that are more serious about Christianity, the Bible, will be very quick to point out that there is a value in understanding that if you do not root out evil cultures and evil practices, then that is going to infect you.
Certainly are aware of these verses, and for centuries, theologians and apologists have attempted to square them with a maximally loving father. The most common responses include divine command theory, allegorical interpretation, progressive revelation, and limited historical application.
Yes, yes, they are mentioned. I would agree. I mean, the only the church that I'm going to right now is very New Testament centered. Before then, I went to a different church. This is when I was at university, and they were actually they preached on the Old Testament almost as much as the New. I kind of go back and forth, and I think there is a lot of value in focusing on the New Testament because it is very important. But obviously, there's also value. Of course, that's the thing. When you actually think about your like, there's no way you can't just as a Christian get by on like your pastor's sermons. You have to read the Bible yourself, because there's no way like any pastor could cover it. I don't know, maybe not even in a lifetime, but no matter what, you're going to be waiting around for a while to actually, hear everything.
Defences we'll now briefly examine. For those wanting a more detailed examination of each response, worry not, we'll produce dedicated episodes in the future, and if you'd like to help us do so quicker, then please consider becoming a patron. So let's begin with divine command theory. This philosophical stance argues that whatever God commands is, by definition, morally right. Proponents insist that God is the source of all morality, so if he commands something, it must be good. Interestingly, while this defense...
I will say this, so I do not like this as a defense, and the reason why is because then we cannot make an ethical criticism of Islam, right? Because if you say that, well, if we say that we have a God and that God commands something, then automatically that thing is morally righteous, then we can't say that when God commanded... I'm trying to think, actually. I don't know. I may be misrepresenting Islam here in saying that this was a direct command from God, but I'm just going to grant this for a second, because I know certainly God does command some bad stuff in Muhammad. I think, for example, I believe the command for him to marry the wife of his adopted son is a direct command, but let's focus on the big one. When Muhammad was commanded, or at least sanctioned by God. Sanctioned. See, the problem with sanction is one of those words that can mean both a good thing and a bad thing. What's the word? I guess like approved of, whatever, by God, when he married a 6-year-old girl, and then, of course, consummated that marriage at 9 years old, that, well, because he's God, if he says that's the right thing to do, you just have to accept that. I know, for example, that, obviously there's Daniel Hakikachu, who, credit to him, is a Muslim who's very honest about what Islam is, and David Wood, who is, of course, a prominent critic of Islam. But David Wood actually said, like, at one point he kind of admitted, and Daniel Hakikachu made a big deal out of the fact he admitted this. If the Islamic God is true, then when he says it's okay to marry a 9-year-old, to have sex with a 9-year-old, and you can even be the pattern of conduct for all humanity while you're having sex with a 9-year-old, that is true because God said it's true. And that's obviously, I think that's a problem to admit that. So I would not say that what happens in the Old Testament is moral simply because God commanded it. What I would say, insofar as I would try to engage with this whole divine command theory thing, is that actually there is I think you kind of have to say in some sense that there is a goodness that is pre-existent from God, but rooted in him, if that makes sense. So basically that God has this nature that is intrinsically perfect, and yet there is an idea of perfectness which God is bound to be conformed to. I feel like there's kind of like an ontological thing with it, like how, and again, like I'm not saying ontology is like a really convincing apologetic, but essentially this idea that God as the maximally greatest being is almost obligated to exist because that's part of what makes him a great being. And that's kind of my attitude. Let's see. Yes. All right. I'm sorry. You know what? I'll be a little bit less responsive to the comments because like I said, we need to make some progress. But again, I'm going to try not to respond to this too much because, again, I don't really agree with divine command theory as it's being expressed here in terms of just like literally the act of God saying something is good makes it good, because I think it has serious limitations.
Defense has significant sway among theologians, it has nearly none at all among philosophers. The reason for this is that it essentially boils down to might makes right, the idea that power alone determines morality, which carries extremely troubling implications. The most prominent of these is that it renders morality...
I wouldn't necessarily say it's true, but again, we're just going to try and make progress. I don't know if it's like accurate to say that divine command theory, because it's not about God necessarily being powerful. I think you could maybe say it's about him being kind of original, but whatever.
Arbitrary. If God could command anything, and by virtue of him commanding it, that act is definitionally good, then morality has no objective basis beyond God's whim. If, for instance, he commands a rape victim to marry her violator, as he does in Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29, then this order is morally good. In fact, the distraught victim has an objective moral duty to marry the monster who so egregiously abused her.
Okay, something about like using AI for like these like serious points always feels like very strange to me, because you know that just like a computer was like, oh, how can I like show like an evil, abusive guy? Yeah, I don't really want to address this whole like marry a rape victim, or like, you know, rape victim marries her rapist situation, because it is like a separate issue. The only thing I'll say there is obviously they had a very different idea of consent and what like rape basically meant back in those days. And with that said, a lot of the time this could be talking about somebody who seduced a woman, and that was perceived to be a like basically taking advantage of her, whereas by our current standards we wouldn't consider it that. In an ancient culture, if a man was like, well, you know, like it's not, but essentially they had that different idea. I was gonna like try and like give a very specific example. I don't know, I'm gonna like waste way too much time like coming up with a specific example. But yeah, because I believe I'm right. I wish I could remember this is correct. There's, because isn't there elsewhere where it basically talks about if a man rapes a woman, then he should be stoned for it? Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. I feel like I remember there's at least some basis for thinking that if the, you know, like if it was like a really serious sexual assault, then that actually does get a punishment. But I might not be right about that. And like I say, it's a bit of a distraction.
This might makes right position not only contradicts the laws God provides in other passages, it grossly violates our moral intuition that apparently God has given us, an intuition that, in other contexts, proponents steadfastly rely upon with the mantra right and wrong is written on our heart. So let's take a closer look at the verses in question. The command, do not leave alive anything that breathes, evokes utter disgust, and yet somehow we're to believe that this carnage is maximally loving. The sheer scale of this commanded violence, the systemic extermination of
the issue with this term like maximally loving is that it gets a kind of this issue with this idea of love, because does maximally loving involve having to love everyone? I don't necessarily think so, right? Because it could mean that you love that which is good. That actually part of being maximally loving means being to some extent selective with the love that you show. Because to be honest, like if you just love everything, that's meaningless, right? Like if someone commits an evil sin and you say, "Oh, I love that, and I love the person who's done it, and I don't even care that they did the sin," then that's not like, what does it mean then if you say, "Oh, I love this person who's done lots of good things, is making an effort to be right"? Like, like imagine if like someone walked up to you, like someone you really respect, who you have a great relationship with, and who you've always like tried to be really good to, and they say, you know, I hate to drop a DMC here, but I love you. You know, the truth is that the closer we've got, I've really come to love you. And you're like, cool. And then like after that, they walk up to some random person they never met before, and they say the exact same thing, and then they walk up to someone who's like actively in the middle of like beating someone up or murdering someone, and they're like, "I love you too." That would actually, you'd be like, well, hold on, that person actually not like, that doesn't make that person more loving. If anything, it devalues their love. So I think part of God being loving involves having a judgment over sin.
entire populations, including women, children, and even animals, is so fundamentally at odds with basic human empathy.
I'll also say this, look, just for the record, because I like to give context. I believe personally that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, in principle, a good thing. And certainly, if they were commanded by God directly, he would have absolute prerogative to do that. Because when you look at what Imperial Japan, and I would say Imperial Japan is probably the most evil society that we have like a strong amount of knowledge about. Because, people obviously talk about Germany during that same period. But in Japan, during the massacre of Nanking, they literally had scoreboards printed in their newspapers showing like which units had like massacred the most civilians, and like treating it as a competition. saying, oh, these people beheaded 1,000 like Chinese, like random Chinese people in a day, but this other one, they did 1,500. So you got to pump up those rookie numbers. And this was like being shown to people. And I mean, obviously you had that, what was it? Unit 223 something, basically that unit where it was literally just the most insane experimentation. That's like a very evil culture, I think you'd agree. And actually, I'd say that there is something intrinsically good about engaging in an act of destruction against an evil culture. So I would say, I don't have any condemnation of Harry Truman whatsoever for saying, like, even if like people get into the question of like, oh, did we need to drop it? Was it necessary to force Japan to surrender? I was like, we don't really need to worry about that. Like when you look at the things that country was doing and the way that culture was, and I mean, it's much better now, right? I mean, Japanese culture, it's still got some issues, but it's definitely not anything like as evil as it was in the mid 20th century. So clearly it did them a lot of good. I don't really think we need to be agonizing over whether it was an absolutely necessary thing. I think it was an appropriate response to the way that culture was being. And this is like Harry Truman, right? He's not God. He's not the ultimate arbiter of morality. He was just a guy in a position to dish out some much deserved justice. So if we're then talking about God, I mean, look, if in the middle of World War II, God had just sent a massive tsunami that completely wiped Japan off the map, I don't think anyone could say, oh, that was, oh, can you? No, like when you look at the things they were doing, it was crazy. And like, don't forget the fact that even after like the atomic bombs happened, the army literally tried to do a coup because they were so averse to the idea of the government surrendering. That's how like crazy this culture is. So if Canaan was anything like that, then to make this big deal about like, oh, how could this be done? Oh, terrible, is ridiculous.
That it strains and in many cases shatters belief. How can anyone consider this not just moral, but ordained by the pinnacle of morality? Worse, let's not gloss over the arbitrary nature of these commands. The fate of entire populations hinges on nothing more than geographic proximity. Distant cities are to be forced into labour or have their men executed and their women and children.
Okay, so it's not about geographic proximity. To clarify a point, the reason why it's related to geographic proximity is because God specifically wanted Israel to go into this land. Well, I'm kind of reading a bit into the text here actually, so take it with a grain of salt. Other people might disagree and have good reasons to do so, but I would say that actually the Canaanite cultures were uniquely immoral compared to other cultures, and that's why God wanted Israel to go into this land, so they could purge it of that unique evil of child sacrifice. So, and I mean, they were doing other things as well as child sacrifice. They obviously had like ritualistic prostitution and things like that. The problem is, like nowadays, like OnlyFans, like people wouldn't necessarily even view that as like an evil thing. So the child sacrifice thing is a better example in that, most people, certainly at least once the baby's been born, would say, oh, you shouldn't kill a baby, even, the most permissive whatever person in the world. So yeah, that's the thing I'm harping on. But the point is, obviously, with that said, it's not about geographic proximity, right? It's about what the cultures are doing and how they're behaving. Now, there is the fact you could say, well, what if there was a culture just on the outskirts that was doing very similar things? Were these people commanded to, like, were the Hebrews commanded to destroy every single culture all over the world? No, because I think there's a sense of the excising that culture from a specific place had a utility to it. So yeah, okay, maybe it is kind of arbitrary to draw a line and say, well, actually, you know what, there was some like dodgy sacrifice and stuff going on in Phoenicia, but because that's not part of the promised land, it doesn't get included. But yeah, I think that ultimately the key point is it's not arbitrary, it's about specifically what they were doing, not just where they were based.
Children plundered. But as for the nearby cities, even this egregious offer isn't extended. No, they are to undergo total annihilation, no exceptions. Just think about the implications here, because really, that's the problem. Theists do not actually sit there and think about this. Twin siblings, separated at birth and raised in different cities, could face drastically different fates based on purely which side of some invisible line they happen to grow up on. One becomes a slave, the other is slaughtered without mercy. And we're supposed to nod along and say, yep, That's divine justice for
Okay, so the thing is, this is the kind of attitude that a lot of atheists, a lot of liberals have, which is this very individualistic attitude where they think that it is absolutely unconscionable that any single individual would have their fate determined based on the society in which they live, which kind of liberals would perceive to be arbitrary. What I would say is that I know that the culture I live in is somewhat arbitrary, but also it makes sense that there is such a thing as collective responsibility, as such, there is such a thing as collective punishment. And you don't have to go through every single individual and show that they were directly responsible for the evil happening in that culture, that they were like, and like prove that they're being punished to the exact extent that they were contributing to that evil. No, ultimately, that there is this sense of collectivism and corporate responsibility, which I think is quite good. I think it is good to have this attitude of, if the UK is being an evil culture, I can't just sit back and say, well, I personally am being a good person, so that's fine. No, I think that actually having a sense of even a newborn baby or a baby not even yet born who has no responsibility for this as part of a broad judgment brought upon the entire society could get swept up in that, because that reminds us that no man is an island, that we're all kind of together. And I would say actually, if you're talking about the implications, the wider implications, I'd say that's a pretty good implication to have, to like basically have that thing of what you do, it doesn't just affect you, it affects your family, it affects your wider culture, and your evil sin can lead to other people getting caught up in the punishment placed on that.
for you. Really? The cognitive dissonance required to accept.
If God did not destroy the Canaanites, why would God allow such evil? Yeah, that's kind of the thing, right? Like basically the alternative scenario, you'd think so. I mean, that's the thing, because obviously atheists, maybe because they just don't ever get around to reading this far into the Bible, they never talk about, and again, I'm just going to blank on the names. It's just, I'm just such a perfect opposite to an encyclopedia when it comes to this stuff. But that king towards the end of the Book of Kings who starts sacrificing children, atheists don't bring that up. Maybe because they're not really aware of it, but maybe because they realize that, oh wait, actually, the reason why that happened is because you still had all these religious people influencing the king to do that evil stuff, and actually he wouldn't have done that if the Canaanites had been slaughtered in a much more complete way. And then, I mean, of course, it's very funny because, atheists do bring up the story of Jephthah, not realizing that that is actually an example of these cultures being influenced by the surrounding culture, Israel being influenced by the surrounding cultures to their hurt.
Accept these commands as the epitome of morality from a maximally loving God is staggering.
Yes, Larry Howard, you are right.
Demands we suspend our most basic moral instincts. To believe this is to believe anything. It's to accept that morality itself is arbitrary, that the rightness or wrongness of an action isn't determined by its nature or consequences, but by the whim of a deity who apparently values geography over compassion. Put simply, divine command theory.
I think this is just like, it's a very stupid thing, right? Because it's it's acting as if any recognition of context is making the morality itself dependent on that context. And so it's kind of like, for example, if we said, oh, people who are less educated, we're going to have less moral expectations of them than we would of people who are, like basically more educated, such you'd expect them to be more wise and more intelligent with the way they behave. And you say, oh, that just makes morality about the arbitrariness of the circumstances of how you're born and what education you have access to. No, it's just saying it's a consideration. And likewise, just because geography is one dimension in which morality is kind of being judged, and almost like kind of a canvas through which you're seeing, like basically you have certain cultures which are better than other cultures, certain civilizations are better than other civilizations, and they're obviously located in different geographical locations, and judgment is being placed upon those different areas. That doesn't mean that it is the geography itself that is the determiner of morality, right?
It doesn't solve the depravity of Deuteronomy, it magnifies it. Now, of course, there's more to be said here, including a big tangent on the Euthyphro dilemma.
Ah, the urethra dilemma.
But for now, we'll move on to the allegorical defense. Some believers, faced with the moral quandary presented in Deuteronomy's violent commands, resort to allegorical interpretation. They argue that these passages shouldn't be taken literally, but rather as metaphors for spiritual truths. In this view, God's command to enslave and annihilate cities represents the need to purge sin from our lives. While this might seem like an elegant solution on the surface, and for this reason it's quite popular, it crumbles under the slightest skepticism.
So I would say this: I have never heard anyone claim that these are not historical accounts, but are metaphors. I've never heard anyone claim that. What I have heard people say is that God doing these actions is an indication of his character, or God, commanding these actions is an indication of his character when it comes to the seriousness of his judgment against sin. But that's like a different thing, right? So there is a message for us about God there, but that doesn't mean the actions themselves are allegorical. And I kind of think, maybe there are some people who literally say that the actions didn't happen and this is just a metaphor. I think that's a very dumb reading, but I kind of suspect that Rationality Rules, certainly in saying this is a popular interpretation, is misunderstanding stuff. I think that what's happening here is he's asking people, well, assuming maybe he's talking to anyone about it or like reading what other people have said, he's inquiring about people's attitudes, Christians' attitudes towards these things. And Christians are saying, well, this shows us God's extreme judgment against sin. And he's thinking that therefore those people are saying that the entire function of this account is not to tell us true history, but just to communicate that information. Whereas, of course, in reality, lots of the Bible communicates true history, but also tells us information about God's character.
The first issue is glaring. Allegorical interpretation is applied with comical inconsistency. Those who employ this defense to sanitize difficult passages still cling to literal interpretations of not so difficult parts of the Bible, even within the same book. To give a few examples from Deuteronomy alone, let's turn a few pages. Theists are not running around saying that the command to protect foreign escaped slaves is just a metaphor, are they? Likewise, they're not insisting.
See, again, the funny thing is, by the exact same token, those commands like that are a picture of Christ and being reconciled to Christ, that escaping slavery, and of course we talk about our slavery to sin. That is, and the same way we also have in Hosea, when his wife, having gone into prostitution, I believe she needs some kind of financial, I believe I'm right that she's indebted, and Hosea is commanded to go and bail her out, basically. And that is an accurate event, but it is also a picture of the nature of God's love for us, that even when we are so committed to our sin that we become enslaved to it, and it actually requires something of God to basically buy us out, to purchase us. And of course, we know we were purchased with his blood, that he's still going to do that. So it's a metaphor, but that doesn't mean it's not an accurate statement or a historical statement.
The requirement for multiple witnesses in capital offences is not to be taken literally.
That's also there's a significant theological thing there, because of course that's one of the key proofs of the fact that God is multiple persons, because Jesus says, out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses it will be established, and he's basically talking about God's witness, and he's essentially saying that God has to be multiple people such that his witness could be, taken seriously, because obviously the Bible says you should believe something if multiple witnesses attest to it. So again, there is a theological significance there, and it does seem to me like this guy is thinking that reading a theological significance into these accounts is saying that these accounts don't have any historical reality.
Cafeteria Christianity, this cherry-picking approach, raises serious questions about the credibility of their interpretive method, exposing that the litmus test for literal interpretation is not the text itself, but rather how palatable the passages are to modern sensibilities.
Yeah, I would be interested if there's any single person who has claimed these accounts aren't real. I've never heard anyone say that.
A further perplexing factor is how the allegorical approach struggles to make sense of the specific details in these passages. If we're to interpret Deuteronomy's commands metaphorically, how do we explain the distinction between distant cities and nearby ones? What spiritual truth is conveyed by the instruction to enslave one group, but to utterly annihilate another? The use of words like plunder and explicit mentions of forced labour don't align neatly with spiritual allegories about overcoming sin. These specific, practical instructions seem jarringly out of place if we're to view the text as purely metaphorical. The acrobatic apologetics required is absurd. It's ridiculous. It's pathetic, even. The cracks in this defense become even more apparent when we examine how allegorical interpretation has been selectively applied throughout history. To scratch the surface, consider the Bible's stance on slavery, the subordination of women, and the death penalty for homosexual practice. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have historically viewed slavery as not just acceptable, but necessary. They've regarded women as second-class.
I would say, historically speaking, slavery was necessary, right? How else do you deal with an entire culture? Like, if you've gone to war with someone, let's say, to be more accurate, let's say they've gone to war with you, you're totally innocent in this, and then you take over their cities. What do? You've only got three options, right? You can slaughter them all, which clearly, Mr. Rationality Rules thinks is a terrible idea, or you can just leave them completely free. In which case, well, you're leaving them in a pretty good position to just do the same thing again. Or you could take them as slaves. And, well, if you do that, then they live and you kind of get basically compensation for the fact that they've invaded you, and you weaken them by basically taking a lot of their labor force away. I don't actually know how you solve that problem without slavery. Similar thing with people being really in debt. They just couldn't really have, when resources were so much more scarce, they couldn't have the same social safety net that we have now. So unfortunately, if someone went into debt, the only real solution there, in order to, because there has to be, because otherwise people just go into debt and there's no consequences, oh, we'll just let you off. No, there has to be a sense of, in order for the economy to continue functioning, there has to be a trust that people are going to stick to their oaths, and that means there has to be some kind of consequence if someone doesn't. So the only real solution there is to have indentured servitude. Yeah, I just think historically slavery was necessary.
Citizens, and they've ensured that all things LGBT were DEAD. Yet today, as
it's a dumb line,
secular and humanist values progress, we suddenly see theists, especially Christians, reinterpreting these transparent commands as mere allegories and metaphors. How convenient. This pattern of reinterpretation, always lagging behind societal progress, exposes a fundamental weakness in the allegorical defense. It's clear that theists are creating God in their own image, sculpting scripture to appease their apprehensions. Now, before moving on, let's land with a quick 2 additional objections to the allegorical defense. First, even if we accept these passages as metaphorical, this wouldn't sufficiently address the core moral issue. It raises the question, why would an all-loving God choose genocide as a metaphor? An all-knowing deity would surely anticipate that such passages would be interpreted literally, leading to doubt about God's loving nature, which in turn potentially results in eternal anguish. Couldn't an all-wise being have selected a less morally repugnant allegory to convey spiritual truths? Second, let's face the elephant in the room. These passages in Deuteronomy are clearly presented as historical accounts, not as obvious parables or allegories. Treating them as pure metaphors requires us to disregard their apparent intent and the way that they've been understood for millennia. Now, sure, most scholars today doubt these events ever occurred, with Moses himself likely being mythical. But for the vast majority of Abrahamic history, these accounts were taken as factual as...
I suppose this mug that I've got is me as a baby. That's how I looked. It's really funny. When I was a baby, I looked a lot more like my dad, but that's because my dad's bald. Yeah, I'm just not really. Again, we're trying to make up some time. I say having just pause to show off my mug, but yeah, we're trying to make up a bit of time. So I'm kind of gonna let that play. I don't think there's anything there that really necessitated being responded to. If I had infinite time, I could have justified it. But yeah, we'll proceed. I really do want to try and finish this. So, we've only got 20 minutes left until I'd ordinarily stop recording.
As the Exodus narrative. The notion they are
10 minutes
allegories
left.
is a recent development, motivated almost entirely by moral cognitive dissonance.
Oh, by the way, I should say, give the video a like, guys. By the way, if you're watching right now, give it a like. I can see 16 of you watching. You really don't have an excuse. If I don't see 16 likes on the video by the end, I will strike you. I'm sorry. I hate to say it, but I will have to, and I think you have it coming. Okay.
Another common defense employed by believers,
this could be interesting. I feel like we're not going to be able to finish the video because I might have too much to say about this,
to reconcile the moral monstrosities in Deuteronomy, is the concept of progressive revelation. This theological idea proposes that God unveils his nature, will, and moral standards gradually over time, adapting his message to humanity's evolving capacity for understanding and the societal constraints of the time. An analogy that's often given is that just as we teach children basic arithmetic before calculus, God reveals more complex theological and moral concepts as humanity grows up, spiritually, ethically, and socially. In this view, God's revelation is seen as a continuum, with each new insight building upon and sometimes even superseding earlier ones. So,
okay, no, I think I will just jump in because I feel like that analogy there probably means he's going to focus on, well, why did God think we wouldn't know that genocide is bad, blah, 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 because of that focus on knowledge, which I don't think is what it's really about. The question you have to ask yourself as, well, someone who's considering the idea of why God would exist is, why do we have human history? Why is it that God didn't just skip straight to, where would I say skip? I was going to say skip straight to jail. That doesn't really work. But yeah, why doesn't God just skip to the good bit and just say, hey, immediately New Jerusalem? And I think if you think about it for a second, like, well, actually, there's a pretty obvious intuitive answer there, which is that there is something to be gained in having experienced human history. So what I would say is not so much, I wouldn't focus on progressive revelation as I would on redemptive history, that we have a history where we have been constantly making progress, we've been constantly changing and moving, and that this is actually leading us towards some ultimate goal, and there is a value in us making it there ourselves. I think there is a reason why God didn't just pop down to Moses and say, hey, everyone, here's my plan for secular liberal democracies and free market capitalism and like everything that we have in the modern age. And by the way, while I'm at it, here's how you harness electricity and make computers or whatever. No, if we're granting and I think, if we're going to have a conversation about anything, we have to kind of grant this. If we're granting that humanity has basically existed and human history has existed, and that is in some way compatible with there being a God, then the obvious explanation is that God is interested in humanity basically making progress going throughout history. And therefore, obviously, that's what we're talking about here. So that's what I need to respond to. So when we talk about, for example, why is it that God has used war as a way to enact his righteousness? Because God is working through human history, and war has been part of human history. And the progression we see is the redemptive history, where war has become less common, where we've seen in the New Testament that that's not how God operates anymore.
So, applied to the passages in question.
Yes, it is why prophecies exist. Progression of scripture is not cope. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, again, if you are going to bring it back to that question of, well, why did God, it's in order to make this, to have an issue of progressive revelation or redemptive history, you would have to be fundamentally questioning why God made human beings exist and why he has allowed human history to continue largely unmolested. And the problem with that is, if you're going to ask such a fundamental question, well, then you have to kind of turn the question around and say, well, why do human beings exist if there is no God? Surely that's a much more challenging question. To me, the idea that God created human beings to essentially watch us and see us progress to a certain type of society, which is maybe one more consistent with what we're going to have in the 1,000 years when Jesus reigns and then forevermore, that makes more sense than human beings exist because nothing exploded and it turned into everything. So if you're going to get into which one makes the most sense of humans existing, God seems to be more logical than atheism. And then if you're going to ask, well, why would humans exist in this way that they do if God created us? The answer would seem to obviously be because he has some investment in watching human history progress.
Opponents argue that the violent commands were appropriate for the time, reflecting the harsh realities of the ancient Near East. The reason we today find these commands so wretched is because, as human civilization progressed, so too did God's revelations.
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I would say that it's not about like God's revelations progress and that's why we find it gross. I would say the reason actually, because again, it's worth noting, God hasn't given us any new revelations since what? I don't know, when was Revelation written? Literally, isn't it interesting? The last Revelation was literally called Revelation. I'm right about that, right? Like Revelation was the last one. And what was that, 100 AD at the latest? But I guess like maybe secular scholars could maybe date it into like the 200 ADs, whatever. But the point is, either way, a long time ago, almost 2,000 years, well over 1,000 years ago, and yet our morality has developed a lot, especially when it comes to things like wars and stuff like that. This isn't because God has given us new revelations. It's because our technology has developed. The reason why we find it so offensive to imagine like a entire culture of people. Oh, okay. Thank you, Joshua Curry. So Joshua Curry says 90 AD. Yes, that makes sense. I was thinking it was around, and that, would I be right that is the, as is the tradition, like basically as a Christian would date it, that is the latest piece of scripture we have. There was no scripture written later than that. Am I right about that? Anyway, yeah. Basically, with the technology we have, we don't need to enslave people anymore. We can, for example, in the future, we might develop technology that's just able to, as effectively as guns, completely pacify an entire city without killing anyone. And when that happens, the idea of killing someone in a war full stop will probably seem wildly offensive to us because the technology develops.
Are you convinced?
Yes.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm
First,
convinced.
progressive revelation contradicts the notion of an unchanging, omnibenevolent God.
No, it doesn't. I mean, literally, like even by the definition he's saying of like God gives new revelation because of us being stupid, that wouldn't mean that God is the one who's like God's staying the same. That's kind of like saying that the fact that you learn like basic maths when you're a little kid and then you learn more complex maths at university contradicts the idea that maths is like objective and universally true. No, just because you're learning more of it as you go along, and maybe even, I mean, I know you could say, well, that doesn't really count because like with God's morality, some of the earlier stuff contradicts the later stuff. Well, I think with like very complicated maths, the really complicated maths can contradict or appear to contradict the less complicated maths. But again, the point is, finding out new information doesn't contradict the idea that that information is, like consistent.
If God
or has always been there as true.
is the source of all morality and is perfectly good, how can his moral standards shift? The idea that the supreme being of the universe would condone genocide at one point in history, only to condemn...
Yeah, someone says, what do I think about Germanic neo? Yeah, I always feel like fascists who, I know that not everyone, but especially fascists who align themselves with a religious point of view that got totally dunked on are kind of embarrassing themselves, because I thought their whole thing was that they believe in really strong stuff. Like their whole thing is like, oh, you got to be like the alpha males or whatever. But it's like, well, Northwest Europeans kind of got dunked on when it comes to, that big thing.
It later isn't just logically bankrupt, it's a moral catastrophe of cosmic proportions.
Oh, it's a moral
two individuals born thousands of years apart, one commanded by God to be enslaved, the other to live free and to prosper. How can we reconcile this stark difference in divine decree? There's no evidence that...
So there isn't a difference in divine decree, really. There's just the fact that, of course, people nowadays have better lives than they did in the past, in a lot of ways. That would track with the idea that we are heading towards, and again, if you want to be a post-millennialist, I think this is a strong argument for it. It seems like in a lot of ways we are heading towards a slightly more idyllic quality of life as long as we can just get a handle on the cultural degeneracy.
Human cognition has undergone such drastic evolutionary changes in just a few millennia to justify this moral disparity. And that's just the empirical front. As for the moral front, are we to believe that the enslaved individual was somehow less deserving of freedom and dignity simply due to the era of their birth? And what of the nearby cities, huh?
Again, and also, you notice this is like a very like vending machine notion of God's like morality, that God's like that basically God created the world to be a morality vending machine where you put in a certain amount of good boy points and you get out a certain amount of rewards, and if you do bad things then you get it, like, and it's just like a perfect one-to-one thing, which of course we know that's not how morality is. I think for most people it makes sense intuitively, whether they're religious or not, that that wouldn't be how morality is, that it's literally just like, you know, I guess, well, karma, which of course some people claim to believe in. But yeah, I think like this idea of that people would expect it to be the case that if you're a slave, that means you're a bad person. If you're not a slave, that means you're a good person. That's certainly not what I would expect.
Cities that God commanded to be utterly annihilated. What sin did those children commit? What gives? Are we not all created in God's image? A second, equally damning objection to progressive revelation is that it reduces God's morality to mere cultural relativism. That is, it insists that God's laws are constrained by cultural limitations. But an all-powerful, all-knowing deity would be capable of revealing a consistent moral code that transcends temporal cultural norms, right? I mean, he had no issue saying, "Don't eat pig."
Well, that's stupid, right? Because dietary things, that is a cultural norm. So you're giving an example of how he'd be capable of like doing things that aren't cultural norms, but then you're giving an example of him saying something which very much tracks with a cultural norm. The point is, yeah, he was capable of doing this, and he did do this for things like, you know, the command not to kill and stuff like that. But again, you seem to be annoyed that God isn't the God that you wanted, even though, again, if it's so weird, because if the God that you wanted was the real God, you wouldn't even be around to make this video, right? Like, if what actually happened is that God came down and immediately just said, here's exactly the way that morality should be universally, and then like he forced everyone to obey that, you will be living in a very different world, a world where, I mean, apart from anything else, because like part of morality is honoring God as the perfect creator of everything, you like would, I guess, not even be allowed to not believe in God. So it just doesn't really make any sense to complain about this from the perspective of someone living in the world that you do, where you have got to, like, do you not see any value, rationality rules, in having lived in a world where there has been a development of human beings over years as we have actually learned things for ourselves? And if you do think there's a value in that, why do you think that God could not likewise see value in that? Why do you not think that there could be a sense in which God has actually said, oh, okay, so here's where they're at as a society right now. Let me tell them, you know, like how I think they should be, but with a mind towards where they're at right now. Why do you think that is totally ridiculous? I don't know.
To put it bluntly, the suggestion that God had to meet people where they are doesn't paint a picture of divine love. It portrays a deity hamstrung by human comprehension, a far cry from the omnibenevolent being most believers claim to worship. Compounding this,
again, the problem is here again, this guy's saying like, oh, this is so crazy because like you know, people think that morality is different in 2000 AD compared to 1 AD, but humanity hasn't massively changed in their attitudes over the past 2000 years. But then it's also true, humanity didn't change its attitudes over the last 1500 years between you know, the time of Moses and the time of Jesus. So why is it that we, like, if the logic here is, oh, God was totally hamstrung by our sense of morality, why is it we get a radically different sense of morality in the New Testament? Like, you can't read the New Testament and say, oh, this is constrained by human sense of morality, because in many ways the New Testament, especially the gospel, is totally going against how human beings think morality should be. And that's why so many human beings are absolutely offended when you tell them the gospel.
Progressive revelation fails to explain why God wouldn't simply start with the highest moral standards from the beginning. If the teachings of, say, Jesus represent the pinnacle of divine morality,
pigs, the little baby pigs are really cute, like little piglets. Love them. You ever seen that like comic where it's like the pig and the dog, and they're like talking, and the dog's like, "Hey, I'm going to the beach. It's gonna be really fun." And then the pig's like, "Oh, I hope I'm going to the beach." And obviously the pig's going to the slaughter house. Yeah. The only like weird thing, like, you know, whatever, you want to be vegan, whatever. But it is kind of funny to me that a lot of veganism does rely on giving animals the ability to comprehend the fact they're going to die, or like to have aspirations and stuff like that, which of course they don't. Like, yeah, it would be sad if for a pig to be killed, if a pig can envision the joy of going to the beach, but I don't think a pig actually can.
Why not begin there? The idea that countless generations had to suffer under inferior moral guidance simply because they weren't ready for the full truth doesn't depict God as a loving father. It casts him as a cosmic tyrant.
Again, God is a tyrant because he's leaving humanity to develop while subtly influencing us by telling us like the way we should be within the context of where we're at. Although again, by the time we get to the New Testament, he's like saying this is the way you can be that goes completely against our culture, but we didn't want to hear that. And the reason, like, if everyone obeyed the New Testament, we would have a very good society. So this idea that like we have these problems because God is a tyrant who's leaving us to do our own thing and telling us what we should do, but not enforcing that upon us. And this is God being a tyrant, which is why the world is bad.
Callously experimenting with human lives and souls. Another hurdle that this defense struggles to overcome is accounting.
This is like one of the things with like atheism when it comes to morality. I think someone said right at the beginning, like perspective is everything. I could scroll up and find it, but yeah, they said it really early on, and it's kind of like that's actually like kind of the point, right? If you look at this stuff and you want to see it as evil and wicked, you can frame it that way. You can say like it's like the way I would frame it is, you know, God is interested in humanity. He wants to see us grow. He wants to see us come to a knowledge of him through the progress of human history. And I would say that like I think that's a very good way of framing it. But yeah, you can just say, oh, this is God experimenting on us. It's kind of like it's the way people read Job, right? Like, is this about God having faith and confidence in the righteousness of Job, or is it God destroying Job's life for a bet?
For more
as if money was exchanged hands.
Moral regressions in scripture. If divine revelation is truly progressive, how do we explain instances where later Bible passages appear less ethically advanced than earlier ones? For instance, the book of Genesis, which precedes Deuteronomy, has Abraham boldly negotiating with God to spare the righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah. Fast forward to Deuteronomy, we find God commanding the utter destruction of entire civilizations. This isn't progress. But perhaps most damningly, this defense implicitly admits that our modern moral sensibilities are superior to those presented in parts of the Bible. By suggesting that we've progressed beyond the brutality of Deuteronomy, believers inadvertently confess a truth they dare not speak out loud. The good book isn't, in fact, good. Progressive revelation is...
Well, again, just to clarify, like you look at things, one of the things we don't do now, again, like abortion and stuff, like that whole thing to one side, certainly for religious reasons, we don't sacrifice children. We don't burn children alive with fire. That's our morality developing, but actually that's our morality catching up with God, right? Because God was condemning that right from the beginning. This idea that, yeah, our morality is more... Again, I don't really know if, like I say, it's better, because again, a big part of it is just the fact we have the ability to behave in a certain way that's different from how people used to behave. But that's not us like getting ahead of God. A lot of that is us catching up with him.
Is, at base, the attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable, to force ancient atrocious texts into alignment with contemporary ethical standards. It's a tacit admission that significant portions of scripture are ethically indefensible. This theological contortion not only fails to resolve the core issues, but...
Again, to clarify, you're saying like this idea, this thing is ethically indefensible. Somebody saying, oh, nowadays we shouldn't go and like invade another country and like murder all their people because we think they're doing something immoral, doesn't mean that it was ethically indefensible in a totally different context where like the abilities of a given culture and like society were much lesser in terms of like, you know, their options in terms of how to handle a conflict. And also when they did have direct access to God's commands, it wasn't indefensible. You can like say nowadays it wouldn't be a good idea. It's same with slavery, right? Like we shouldn't have slavery now. I don't think slavery is a good thing now, but it doesn't mean slavery in the past was ethically indefensible.
Introduces new logical inconsistencies and theological conundrums, further eroding the credibility of the very texts it aims to defend. Apologists sometimes turn to the argument of limited historical application. This approach posits that the command for conquest, slavery, and genocide in Deuteronomy were specific directives given to the ancient Israelites for a particular time and place.
Yeah.
To support this view, proponents cite factors such as 1. The perceived wickedness of the
We should be ending now, but we'll tell you what, we'll just like try and be very, I almost want to turn, I'll turn up the speed to 1.2.
Canaanite cultures, who
Yeah.
God warns will teach the Israelites to sin against him if they are not utterly destroyed. 2.
Yep.
The need to establish a pure monotheistic society.
Mhm.
And 3. The fulfillment of divine promises regarding the land.
Absolutely.
To especially lay people, this defense can seem more palatable than the previous ones. After all,
yeah.
it doesn't require
To be honest, he should have started with this, because this is the main defense, right? That this culture was doing evil things, so they needed to be destroyed.
us to accept that genocide is morally good, nor does it suggest that God's objective moral
Well, sorry, it does require us to accept that this particular genocide was morally good.
standards have changed. Instead, it attempts to quarantine these troubling commands to a specific historical context. However, the most glaring objection to the limited historical application defense is that it simply fails to address the core ethical issue at hand. Even if we accept that these commands were only meant for a specific time and place, it doesn't change the fact that God allegedly ordered the slaughter of innocent children and the enslavement of entire populations. Indeed, the specificity doesn't resolve the contradiction between God's supposed loving.
Sorry, okay, so I realized, so this guy's like misunderstood. He thinks that like this attempt to say, oh, it was just about this specific culture is just because then we can say, oh, and therefore because it only applied to that particular culture, it wasn't that bad because it only applied to them. No, the fact it applied to this specific culture and the specific things that culture is doing means it wasn't bad at all because it was a righteous judgment against these people.
Nature and his commands for atrocity, we're left where we started, clutching the same question. How can a perfectly loving God,
that's kind of how I'm left feeling. I also need a wee, but we'll just power through,
order the murder of innocent children based merely on the proximity to his chosen people? Secondly, if these commands were truly limited in application, why doesn't the text clearly state this? Why doesn't God say that the Israelites are not to enslave people beyond a certain mile radius, or after a certain date? The absence of such clarification is striking, especially for a book purportedly meant to guide believers for all time. When it suits...
Well, again, sorry, I think like if he's saying wipe out all of the people within this culture, like within these cities and within this specific land, I think it goes without saying, once they've done that, they stop, right? Like you don't have to, I don't know, this isn't like computer programming where, you have to like do a like, then stop, like issue in that specific command. If you're told to do a thing, then it logically goes with like without saying that once you've done that thing, you're done.
Him, God specifies his targets, such as in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where specific cities are named, or in the command to utterly destroy the Amalekites, where a particular group is singled out. Even within Deuteronomy itself, we see specificity, like the command to destroy the cities of Sion. So, why are the conquest commands in Deuteronomy not similarly specified? Why is the criterion for destruction merely proximity to Israel rather than specific peoples or places?
Well, that is specific, right? These specific people close to Israel, again, like at that time, right? Because again, if you understand that these were cultures that practiced human sacrifice, then it's obvious, right? Like you can just put two and two together and say, oh, that's the problem.
This omission has led to millennia of misuse and abuse of these passages to justify colonialism, slavery, and genocide, entailments that an all-loving God,
I guess, look, we should say, for the record, free Palestine,
would have anticipated. Lastly, proponents of this defense don't apply it consistently. When's the last time you heard a theist argue for a limited application of passages that they favor, such as love your neighbor as yourself? This selective application exposes the argument as a convenient escape hatch for difficult verses, rather than
that's like, I'm not going to get into like the whole thing there of why that doesn't make any sense. Obviously, like specifically saying like talking about war, which is a human thing, that's like a specific like human institution, is very different from talking about love, which is a universal human emotion that we feel from like person to person, rather than like something that's done by governments or whatever.
A consistent interpretive principle. Mark Twain once quipped, "It ain't the parts of the Bible I can't understand that bother me. It's the parts that I..."
All right, I think we're done now. So, I just don't think that we really need to finish it. And I need to go, especially since I kind of have a hard limit here because, believe it or not, well, I say believe it or not, it's not the most shocking thing in the world. I'm not actually staying in this. So my bedroom is in that place. but I'm not staying in this bedroom. I haven't been staying in this bedroom for a while now, but I'm especially not staying in it today because someone else is. So eventually they're going to come in. There's lots of interesting. Oh, default. Well, hello, and just be here for the next one. The next one, by the way, will not. So there will not be any stream at all next week because I'll be in North Carolina, and it doesn't really matter I'm in North Carolina specifically, but I will be. Pray for me on the plane journey because I am anxious about that, and I know that having 17 people and hopefully more out there praying for me will help. So thank you. And what else? Thank you. Yeah, thank you for being here, Josh Curry. Oh yeah, and then next week. The week after that, I'll be getting back on Tuesday morning, like really early. And I'll kind of have to assess because I'll be super jet lagged. Obviously, as if you've ever flown transatlantic before, you'll know all of the flights coming back from the US are overnight. And I'm not one who's able to really sleep on planes. And like I struggle to get to sleep when I'm in my comfy bed. It still takes me like a good half an hour or so. So yeah. So we'll see how I am, but at some point the week after that I'll aim to do it, but it won't be Monday, of course, because Monday I will be in the sky. So yeah, but yeah, definitely just nothing next week. So we're coming back. We're coming back. Actually, we're doing another response to Trent Horn. So all of the cathodox bros who've been on my side here, like, yeah, you dunk on that atheist, you're gonna have to assume your usual what's the word? Antagonistic role. All right, bye.